Hello and welcome to Press TV Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi. Thanks so much for being with us. Rapprochement seems to be the word of the day for many Arab countries regarding Syria. Now, this after many of them cut off ties with Syria back in 2013 and 2014. Now that it is obvious that the Syrian government isn't going anywhere, relations are starting to be rekindled from Oman to Egypt to Saudi Arabia and others. And now Saudi Arabia is inviting Syria to rejoin the Arab League and to attend the next meeting, which will be held in Saudi Arabia itself. What does it all mean and why now? Stay with us on this spotlight to find out. I'd like to welcome my guest now to the program. Peter Ford, a former British ambassador to Syria out of Manchester. And Isha Krishnaswamy, podcaster and journalist out of St. Petersburg. Well, thank you both for being with me on this spotlight. Let's start it off in Manchester. And Peter, your evaluation of the role Russia is playing to try to mend fences between Damascus and Riyadh. Let's start from there.
Did you say me?
Yeah, this is for Peter. It's for Peter.
Oh, sorry.
Okay.
Russia has played an extremely important role as a kind of marriage broker, an intermediary at what used to be a difficult moment in Saudi-Syrian relations, given that Saudi Arabia had been supporting the armed opposition. But this is what Russia does so well, serious diplomacy. In fact, they're giving the Americans a master class in how to conduct Middle East diplomacy. And this summit with Assad probably invited is going to crown their achievements.
Isha, why do you think this rapprochement is taking place at this time by these Arab countries?
Well, obviously, one of the biggest signs is the declining U.S. influence in the region, because back in 2013, when all these countries broke off ties, they were very confident that the opposition side would win this war. And on top of that, they also did not want to isolate or alienate the U.S. by disobeying them. And so what this shows is obviously the fact that the Syrian Arab army has been very successful in the past 8 to 9 years in pushing the opposition's territorial gains to a very small area. And number two is, of course, the West's waning influence in the Middle East. Just a month ago, China brokered a deal between Iran and Saudi Arabia. And as Iran and Syria have been allies for a really long time, it's a natural progression that Syria will be welcomed back into the fold.
Well, Peter, in general, what does it mean for Syria? When it was constantly told, I mean, from 2013 on, how many times we heard Assad must go, that government must be overthrown. And now, years later, the Syrian government is intact. So many of those Western governments that said that, the heads have been changed. And what does it mean now for the Syrians when these Arab countries are coming back and trying to reestablish diplomatic ties?
It's kind of symbolically important more than militarily important. It's been a long time now that the Arab, or most of the Gulf countries, stopped giving active support to the armed opposition in Syria. So it's not, this new rapprochement is not going to change what was already an improved situation on the ground, but it's very important politically. It demonstrates that Syria has survived, that Syria is going from strength to strength regionally, and I think above all, it puts pressure on the United States, which is going to interpret this as a slap in the face, and indeed that is what it is. Let us not make any mistake. This is a big setback for U.S. Regional diplomacy, and a calculated one on the part of Saudi Arabia. a lesson to the Americans and will put them under pressure to withdraw their forces from Syria, which is the biggest obstacle to Syria's recovery, because the Americans control the area that has Syria's oil and grain.
Okay, we're going to get on to that again a little bit later, but in general, Isha, I want to look at, Peter talked about this being a slap in the face to the Americans. I want to look at that, expand on that a little bit more, because now with Saudi Arabia actually reestablishing or trying to reestablish ties and inviting Syria to rejoin the Arab League, what is the difference now as opposed to years ago? Saudi Arabia would not have dared to go against its Washington masters, but tell me your take on what is going on.
About a year ago, China and Saudi Arabia had a long discussion and kind of got into an agreement where there was some military security issues. And so, of course, this means that Saudi Arabia feels less threatened, more confident in opposing the U.S. On top of it, the opposition has failed, so they don't have to worry about the wrath of the opposition, who naturally are members of Al-Qaeda, ISIS, etc., coming back home and feeling that wrath. So I think those are the two things. On top of this, I read a Council for Foreign Relations report where President Biden last year basically wanted MBS to increase the oil production to bring down the oil. And they literally said that Saudi Arabia's traditional role is to basically pump when we ask them and to not pump when we ask them. And I think for Saudi Arabia, they realized that just being the pumper of oil for Washington is not a long-term viable strategy. So I think these things combined, and also just looking at the weakening of the U.S. influence in this region, has made them think about their priorities and think about their longer-term survival. And that's why this is going on, in my opinion.
Well, Peter, your take, how do you think this is going to affect Riyadh-Washington relations now that Riyadh is making these type of moves that they are?
Well, I think this turn in Saudi strategy occurred really about 3 years ago, at the time of there was a tanker war going on in the Gulf, and it was all part of the American economic war on Iran, and America's stepped up efforts at that time to stop Iranian tankers taking oil through the Gulf. And about that time, there was an attack on a Saudi oil refinery by a drone attack. Many observers attributed that to Iran, but it wasn't clear. Anyway, Saudi Arabia, I believe, drew the conclusion at that moment that it could not rely on American protection. And what was striking was that when it happened, the U.S. Ships that were in the area withdrew so that they would be out of range of drone attack. That, I think, underlined to the Saudis that they were on their own, and that they were more likely to be dragged into America's wars than have America defend Saudi Arabia. And what we've seen over the last 3 years has been the gradual elaboration of this tendency. Saudi realism, they realize that they have to get along with Iran. We saw the recent meeting of the two, and now this new step goes further to cement the new relationship.
Well, Isha, Russia also wants to help Syria and Turkey reestablish relations. Let's talk about that side of things. How likely do you see this happening, and especially that, you know, Turkey is still occupying Syrian territory? Your assessment of that?
Well, there's two things. Yes, Turkey is still occupying Syrian territory, and they're also funding a lot of the opposition in that territory too. So I think for Syria for there to be a realistic rapprochement, Turkey definitely needs to pull back from the occupied territory. And worst of all, in the territories that have Turkey-friendly troops occupying it, basically that's where 1/3 of Syria's grain grows and a large portion of Syria's oil. And basically Syria is not getting the hard currency from that area. And that is a big problem for Syria. And Washington's strategy about in 2019, the Deputy Defense Secretary basically mentioned the strategy of how they wanted to occupy this area as a way of like starving Syria out so that people would not want the Syrian Arab army and the current government there. And so as long as Turkey is aiding and abetting that, it's going to be hard. But I also think that Turkey understands what's going on, because a few months ago, there was a terrorist attack in Turkey, and the Turkish foreign minister refused to accept Washington's condolences because obviously it seems like they have intelligence as to who is really behind it. So I think there are two things. Turkey understands its precarious position and the fact that Russia is a neighbor and there's the big Black Sea area that and it's like geostrategic position there. So, but on the other hand, Turkey is definitely occupying, was a large player in this war. So I feel like, again, Turkey is probably thinking about the long-term interests and what suits their business interests and what suits their military interests. Mm-hmm. And so I think they're more open to negotiation now than they ever were before.
Okay. Peter, I want to pose that same question. I want to hear your take on the Turkey-Syria aspect of it. And also, can Syria really return to normal when they have such vast amounts of land still being occupied, when the United States, American troops are there, when the Americans are stealing their oil? I'd like to hear your perspective on both.
Erdogan is under a lot of domestic pressure to fix the Syrian file. Turkey has been hosting over 1 million Syrian refugees, and most Turks want them returned to Syria. That's not going to happen while Turkey has bad relations with Syria and is effectively occupying part of Syria. It was always inevitable that sooner or later Turkey would withdraw from northwest Syria. They're not defending any Turkish-speaking minority. They have no claims on territory in Syria. Their efforts to change the government in Syria are obviously not going to succeed. So it was inevitable that sooner or later they were going to draw the conclusion that they should withdraw. But the problem is how to withdraw gracefully. And this, I think, is where Russian diplomacy is key. They've advanced very, very gradually, quietly, a lot of work behind the scenes. But it does look now, with this quadripartite meeting on the horizon, that the end is in sight. And at some point in the next 12 months, the Turkish forces will withdraw, probably leaving a situation, a rather messy situation, similar to that you have in southern Syria, where, again, Russia brokered a peace that left some of the armed militias still keeping some of their weapons, but effectively working with the government. It's going to be very messy, especially in Idlib. There are going to be a lot of security problems. Mm-hmm. Syria will be keen to reestablish its sovereignty over the northwest, and then again that will put pressure on the Americans to remove their last piece on the chessboard in Syria and allow Syria to get back control of its oil. And this question is absolutely key to Syria's economic and therefore political recovery. The top priority is to get back control of those oil and grain-rich provinces. Mm-hmm. But Syria is used to suffering misery. They have immense resilience.
Okay, well, Isha, what about the Israeli role in all of this in trying to create chaos in Syria? I mean, we've just witnessed a few more attacks on Syrian soil. Tell me about that side of things.
Well, there are two things. Of course, Israel sees Iran and also Hezbollah which as a big existential threat. And they identify, unfortunately, Syria as, they think Syria is a client state of Iran. And so, unfortunately, they see this as a security threat. That's the first thing. The second thing is that the amount of action that the US can actually take in Syria is limited. As we learned last week, there was a drone strike that actually did hit a US airbase. So Israel is basically acting as US's long arm in the region in order to continue the US interests. And the US strategy is definitely based on the continued presence of the moderate rebels and also the ability for the occupied territories to take away Syria's oil and Syria's grain and other things. So Israel has been doing that. And of course, there's the issue of Golan Heights, which Israel took from Syria. And recently, Syria asserted that it wanted it back. So I think these three issues have kind of culminated in the most recent attack on homes.
Well, Peter, is all of this what we're seeing just indicative of the end of the U.S. rules-based international order?
Permit me a hollow laugh about that phrase, rules-based. The rules that they make, but not internationally approved rules, not the UN Charter, not the ICC, the International Criminal Court, to which America is not a party, although they try to make use of it against Russia. I think the rest of the world it just laughs when America and Europe uses this phrase, respect for the rules-based order. That means their order,
right.
Them ordering the rest of the world around. But if I may, just to go back to these Israeli attacks, which are, of course, blatant contraventions of international law and any kind of rules-based order, I think we can interpret them as a sign of failure. The Israelis say they're carrying out these attacks to stop Iran becoming more entrenched in Syria. Well, if they're having to increase so much the number of these attacks, there have been 9 so far this year, I believe. Doesn't that prove that the strategy is failing and that Iran is, if anything, ever more deeply entrenched in Syria? And why? Precisely to help Syria defend itself against Israel.
Isha, your overall perspective, the future of Syria, what do you think it will take to get Syria up and running again, a more sense of normalcy again?
The very first thing is weakening the sanctions regime. These sanctions that the US put Syria under is completely draconian. And the problem is that even when something is not covered under sanctions, companies are afraid of getting the wrath of the US and European community that they just won't sell. So Syria has trouble getting medical equipment. Syria has trouble getting ambulances. These basic things. They have trouble with construction and equipment. So definitely weakening and eliminating or finding a workaround the US sanctions, which are extensive. And even after the recent earthquake, the US refused to change it or lower it, even though they claimed they did. They didn't actually end up doing it. So that is the first thing. The second thing is, of course, getting rid of the area in the northeast that's been occupied by Rojava and also other moderate rebels, because that is such a resource-rich area for Syria, and they need all the hard currency they can get in order to trade and get new equipment for reconstruction. Those are the main two things. And of course, having diplomatic relations restored with other Arab countries is going to help the trade part. And it's going to be a long road, and it's a very difficult road as long as the US and UK and NATO keep their current position on Syria.
Okay. And on that note, I appreciate both of you being with me on this spotlight. Peter Ford, former British ambassador to Syria out of Manchester. Isha Krishnaswamy, podcaster and journalist out of St. Petersburg. And viewers, we appreciate you being with us on another Spotlight. I'm Marzieh Hashemi signing out for myself and all the crew right here in Tehran. Hope to see you right here next time. Goodbye.